In January 1959, a group of 9 experienced ski hikers departed from Sverdlovsk on a planned winter expedition into the northern Ural Mountains. The group consisted of university students and recent graduates, most with technical or engineering backgrounds, and all with documented experience in long-distance winter travel. The expedition was organized, registered, and approved through standard sporting channels in place at the time. The group was led by Igor Dyatlov, a radio engineering student recognized among his peers for methodical planning and calm leadership. Prior expeditions under his direction had been completed without incident. The route selected for this journey was challenging but not unprecedented, and its difficulty level was consistent with the group's training and prior accomplishments. Their intended path crossed a remote mountain pass near Kholat Syakhl, an area characterized by exposed slopes, sparse tree cover, and prolonged winter darkness. The region was largely uninhabited during the winter months and difficult to access without skis. Weather conditions at the time were within seasonal expectations for the area, with low temperatures and intermittent wind. On February 26th, searchers located the group's tent on an exposed slope that would later be informally named Dyatlov Pass. The tent was partially collapsed, but remained secured to the ground. Examination revealed several long slashes in the fabric, determined by investigators to have been made from the inside. The tent contained boots, heavy coats, food supplies, notebooks, cameras, and most personal equipment. The first anomaly appears at the tent site. The shelter was not destroyed by an external event, nor was it buried or displaced. It remained anchored, partially collapsed under snow accumulation, but structurally recognizable. The slashes in the fabric were clean and purposeful, positioned at heights consistent with deliberate exit rather than blind tearing. Investigators determined these cuts originated from inside the tent, a conclusion that has never been formally disputed. Abandoning a primary shelter at night in sub-zero temperatures is not a spontaneous act for trained hikers. The group possessed the tools and experience to manage severe weather, including the ability to reinforce the tent, redistribute weight, or remain stationary until daylight. Yet the tent was evacuated rapidly, without boots, coats, or essential survival equipment, and without any attempt to retrieve those items afterward. Footprints leading away from the tent were documented in the snow. They descended the slope toward the tree line in an orderly fashion, roughly parallel, with no clear indication of panic or disorganization. Some impressions were left by socked feet, others by bare skin. The tracks did not show signs of running or falling. They suggested controlled movement under duress rather than flight. At a certain point, the footprints ceased to be visible. This was attributed to wind and snow conditions, but the abruptness remains notable. There is no documented divergence where individual paths separate sharply, nor evidence of a chaotic dispersal. Instead, the trail ends as though the group reached a threshold beyond which record-keeping becomes incomplete. Environmental assessments conducted during the search reported no avalanche debris in the vicinity of the tent. The slope angle was later measured and logged as insufficient to support a slab avalanche under typical conditions. Snow cover was present, but not disturbed in a way consistent with sudden mass movement. Despite this, the group did not return to the tent, even though it remained visible from below. Several search logs and field notes contain irregularities. One entry ends abruptly mid-sentence, with no indication of damage or loss. Another resumes later with altered handwriting and no reference to the missing text. Autopsy findings introduce the next layer of mystery. 4 individuals suffered internal injuries of significant magnitude, including crushed rib cages and skull fractures, injuries typically associated with high-energy impacts. The chest injuries indicate massive internal trauma, but no corresponding skin damage. The investigators said it was a compelling force, like pressure. But pressure from what? There was no debris field, no collapsed snowpack, no fallen trees. Radiation testing conducted on select clothing items revealed elevated levels on garments belonging to 2 individuals. The report notes this finding briefly, classifies the levels as above background, and then moves on. No explanation is provided for why only certain items were affected, why others worn by the same individuals were not, or why no broader environmental testing was recorded. Witness statements from search participants reveal subtle linguistic overlaps. Multiple accounts, recorded independently and days apart, describe the slope using the same descriptor, quiet. The word appears without qualifiers, as if substituting for a more complex sensory impression that was not formally articulated. The repetition is noted here not for its content, but for its consistency. Time of death estimates present another compression. Despite evidence that the group traveled, paused, and relocated over distance, the estimated windows overlap closely. Hours appear condensed into a narrow time frame, even though physical evidence suggests sequential movement and decision-making rather than simultaneous collapse. The order in which bodies were found does not correspond neatly to the hypothesized sequence of events. Those presumed to have died first were not always closest to the tent. Those with the most severe injuries were not located along a clear path of travel. The spatial arrangement resists linear reconstruction. When examined collectively, the group's actions appear structured. The evacuation of the tent was communal and decisive. There is no evidence that one individual fled first and others followed in panic. The descent toward the forest suggests a shared objective, possibly seeking shelter, firewood, or terrain relief. At the tree line, evidence indicates a temporary occupation. A small fire was built beneath a cedar tree, its remains documented and photographed. The fire appears to have been maintained briefly, sufficient to warm hands and perhaps dry clothing, but not sustained long enough to suggest a viable long-term survival strategy. Branches on the cedar were broken several meters above ground level. This has been interpreted as evidence of climbing, though the purpose remains unclear. The height exceeds what would be necessary for collecting deadwood, suggesting either repeated ascent or an attempt to gain elevation for observation. Two bodies were found positioned as if attempting to return uphill toward the tent. Their orientation and location imply a conscious decision to reverse course, despite the conditions. Others were discovered later in a ravine, their bodies covered by snow accumulation and their injuries markedly more severe. The ravine group's injuries differ in both type and intensity from those found near the tree line. The terrain in the ravine does not obviously account for the forces involved, and the delayed discovery complicates reconstruction. Snow coverage explains concealment, but not trauma. The distance between the tent and the cedar tree measures approximately 1.5 kilometers. Under the recorded conditions, barefoot or lightly clothed travel over that distance would require sustained coordination and endurance. There is no clear evidence of collapse along the way, nor signs of repeated falls. Throughout this movement, there is no documented attempt to retrieve equipment from the tent, despite its visibility and the group's demonstrated capacity for planning. The decision not to return appears deliberate rather than forgotten. The tent remains standing on the slope. No environmental event is recorded that would have rendered it inaccessible after the initial evacuation. The investigative file concludes without reconciling these inconsistencies. Later administrative reviews reclassified the incident under different categories, adjusting terminology but introducing no new explanatory mechanisms. The narrative shifted slightly, emphasizing environmental exposure while leaving earlier observations intact. The location was eventually reopened to travel. Hikers returned in subsequent years. No permanent warning markers were installed, and no restrictions remain in effect. The terrain functions as ordinary wilderness, despite the volume of unresolved documentation associated with it. The investigation was closed in May 1959. The final conclusion cited a compelling natural force. However, one keeps but thinking about the footprints, how they stop at the tree line, how there are no signs of pursuit, no second set following them, just 9 people leaving, together, because something else had already arrived.